particularly in the capital finance side of this equation, which is, unless there's money, and I don't look at it as being real, but how do you know when you're winning or you're losing?
Well, first off, I just want to say thank you for having us here. I represent the Office of Strategic Capital, and if those of you who aren't aware of our office, we're still pretty young. We're only about a little over 2 years old at this point. And we're a federal credit program inside of the Department of Defense. What's federal credit? It's basically a bank inside of the DoD. So we're authorized to provide loans and loan guarantees to a wide set of areas in multiple sectors and industries that are important to national security. And critical minerals was added to that list in the FY25 NDAA. So just as the last panel talked about, Congress's support for this initiative is one of the priority areas for investment out of OSC. Now, as you were talking about,
Can I just interrupt you just say, how is there not an Office of Strategic Capital 10 years ago?
I mean, I think that there was, if you look back decades to maybe the last great power competition, and you see what the U.S. government did in the capital markets, in the credit markets. I tell a story all the time about this program called the Small Business Investment Company Program, SBIC program. In 1957, Sputnik crossed our skies. In 1958, the Eisenhower administration created DARPA, they created NASA, right? We're competing in technology competition. They created the SBIC program. What's SBIC? It's government-backed private capital investment funds that grew and accelerated this brand new asset class called venture capital. And at one point in the late 1960s, 2/3 of all venture capital in the United States backed by the U.S. government, investing in companies like Intel, Sun, Cray Research, world's first supercomputing company. All were backed through investment funds that were backed by the U.S. government. And the kicker is that these federal credit programs, these banks, return money to the taxpayer, right? So they're the only part of the defense budget that gives money back to the Treasury Department, right? Because they're loans. It's not a grant.
Right.
We expect a return for our investment. Now, the trick is that we have to invest in areas that have a commercial nexus. And I think critical minerals is a great example of that. It's a commercial industry that has a national security nexus. It's undercapitalized commercial industry that has a national security nexus, right? As General Allen talked about, the department cannot fly, fight, and win. I'm an Air Force guy. Without access to the critical components all the way down to the raw materials that comprise our military systems, but we don't buy them. We don't buy these critical systems. We don't buy the components, we buy the system. So we expect the supply chain to be there, and we are tracking and have been tracking for the last few years the gap in a resilient supply chain that supports our military apparatus, and that gap is not necessarily part of the defense industrial base. It's part of the industrial base that supports the Department of Defense.
So, to get back to the part of the equation of how do you know if you're making progress on this or not, I also listened to General Allen talking not only about the Saudi deal that may be hatched, but there are other players in this, India, China, others are sort of moving right now. I've talked to Eric Schmidt the other day, the former chairman of Google, who says America's already lost the EV race because of the lack of focus on the critical EV materials that are required. So as you're benchmarking our progress, do you have a war room, or do you have a place that's actually looking at and tracking and marking those dependencies and how we're making progress on them?
If you look at our FY25 investment strategy, we publish a strategy annually that highlights how we target different priority areas for investment. And what we're trying to make an assessment in is, what are the areas of strategic competition authorized by Congress to make investments into, in which we are lacking capital availability? Because we think our national comparative advantage in this competition is our capital markets. Mm-hmm. Why? Half the world's private capital is in the United States. Half. It is a comparative advantage. It is zero sum, and half of it's here. So how do we work with the capital markets to increase investment into these areas, generate the production that we need to see at price points that increase the competitiveness of the U.S. and allied industrial bases, and do it by returning money to the taxpayer? And that solution set is one that we've been working on for the last few years, and now we've just hit market with some of these financial products, and it's working. I mean, we launched our first direct loan program earlier this year. We had applications open for 30 days. Congress believed in the idea, pushed the idea, made it happen, and we had about $1 billion to finance against that first call for applications. In 30 days, we received $9 billion of credit requests.
And do you pay attention to whether those assets and facilities that are being financed are happening in the US or happening abroad? Because the other part of this is the geographic reality that a lot of the rare earths and strategic minerals and supplies we need are not in the geographic boundaries of the United States. It's one of the reasons maybe Christy Rogers here has been thinking about global supply chains and PRISM and the other people looking at that. So are you financing operations in Africa, in Southeast Asia? Is that part of the equation?
Our initial focus is in the United States. And I think what we've seen through the current engagement with the applicants is that we're really targeting processing facilities, right? So I think that there's a lot of different parts of the U.S. federal government are looking at different parts of this problem set, from permitting to mining to extraction. And where we see the biggest gap and where we can accelerate investment domestically is processing. Why? Because if we process it here, then we have a secure source of supply here. Right? And that's, at the end of the day, what we need to look at from a DoD lens is for the minerals that are prioritized for the department, we need to make sure that we have secure sources of supply.
So what's the story there? Again, I'm coming at this as a layperson. Another way to say processing is refining. And I know from talking to people about copper and a lot of other things that a lot of the materials we developed are actually refined in China. If you use lysine leaching, another thing I've learned a little bit about, you don't need all that smelting, refining process. So how bad is the structural deficit on the processing / refining capacity of the U.S.? Are we going from very low to something which looks like it's growing big, or do you expect in part through what you're doing, that we're going to see a significant order of magnitude change in the processing and refining capacity of the U.S.?
I do expect that there's going to be a delta increase in processing. I mean, and again, it's not just the Department of Defense, it's also many of the parts of the federal government, the Department of Energy, Department of Interior, all these are focused on this part of the problem. So, and we do see a large structural gap in processing. Now it's mineral by mineral dependent. And some of the new innovative technologies that are being developed today are also going to be mineral by mineral dependent. And to be honest, some of the stuff that the department is really focused on are areas of the mineral need space that are not massive bulk, right? It's not a huge source. It's a relatively small part of the mineral space, but they are critical for the DoD. And so as we look through the landscape, we're trying to create a multi-pronged approach. So there are kind of two ways we look at the problem set. Is one, we've got to process for what we have today to be able to meet the needs of today. Then we also have to invest in the next generation. And so the way we operate is we operate directly with companies at scale in the hundreds of millions of dollars of financings, but we also work directly with investment funds. Again, still government loans that the funds have to pay back, but because they receive partnership with the U.S. government, they invest in innovative technologies that are targeting this problem set, which in the, all the way down to the venture seed stage capital investment stack, generally has been ignored for the last 30 years. And so in partnership with us, we've seen an uptick in not only later stage processing investments, but also earlier stage venture investment in this space, which is bringing in a whole new set of technologies.
So Jason, are you sort of, I hate to put words in your mouth, but is this a sort of secret sauce, the finance side? I have to be honest, I interview a lot of people about critical materials and minerals. I was blown away when Michael Faulkner, the current Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, talked about, very similarly to you, the power of the financing side of this equation. Because when you talk to most people, a lot of miners, you're talking about a very linear, deliberate process. Go build a mine, deal with permitting. It's not done in the same way when you particularly when you think about the scale of financing. But one of the questions when you kind of look at the president's executive order and looking at the requirements about working across the lines, I find very few people literate on the finance side of this equation. Michael Faulkner would be one, you're clearly another, there may be others there, but how appreciated are you in that ecosystem inside Trump land on this executive order to kind of get this right? Because I don't find a lot of people talking about the finance side of this.
We've been talking about issues in our supply chain, at least this kind of initial cohort that was able to stand up this office since COVID. And I think at that point, there was a larger recognition of what the Department of Defense has been dealing with for many years, which are these, how do we build a resilient supply chain for the DoD? And so for us, it's always been existential. But the next step was always to focus on driving innovations in the finance space that's going to allow us to increase investment in these areas, because we can't buy our way out of this problem set. Even though the DoD has the largest budget of any department in the U.S. government, this is not a buying problem, right? This is a capitalization issue, and it's capitalization to a price point for commodities that can be sold globally. And if we can get the prices to a point where we can be competitive in the global market, not just through financing, but through all the range of different tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal, we can climb our way back out of this problem.
Well, I want to thank you, Ray. You know Jack Bergman, by the way, the Congressman Jack Bergman here.
I just met him.
Whose ancestors were iron miners, all this stuff based up on iron miners. You know, basically the highest ranking combat veteran in America, but he cares a lot about this issue. I don't know if you know each other, but I think that if you allied and kind of looked at the big national security dimensions of these questions with John Allen and others, you know, helped launch here. But I do think that, you know, after doing these programs in Europe and others, there are not enough discussions about what you can do with kind of explosive power, potentially of financial backing, et cetera. So Jason Rathke of the Office of Strategic Capital at the U.S. Department of Defense, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Now let me invite to our show Jack Bergman, Congressman from Michigan, and as I just said, he's a combat veteran. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, House Veterans Affairs Committee, Oversight Task Force. You're in the middle of it. You're also really interestingly, because I've been to Pakistan, I don't know how many people there, you've got some thoughts on Pakistan, the co-chair of the Congressional Pakistan Caucus. So thank you so much, Representative, for joining us. Look, we're trying to figure out, we have a report which GLOBESEC Geotech Center has put out that looks at this growing gap between need and what we've got. And as you kind of look at the future, and then if you add on to that, there's a little bit of a couple of rifts going on in the world, we were sort of joining at the hip for China, now we're ripping at the hip. And there are a lot of things going on to kind of look at how you get the equilibrium right for U.S. assets, U.S. industry, the national security needs. And we'd love to get your thoughts on how you think, what our deficits are in our policy side of getting our critical minerals challenges right.
Well, number one, this thing on?
I don't know.
Push the button.
There you go.
Push the button.
There you
The
go.
candle back. For those of you who remember the movie Young Frankenstein.
Sure.
Uh,
Thank you for remembering that movie.
well, there were some really great actors back then, and when comedy and humor was really, really good and not, it brought people together, it didn't
Exactly.
separate them. Having been in Pakistan recently, and I left from there and went to a different country, Norway, the commonality is they both have a very strategic place on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very different capabilities, very, very different opportunities, but both are essential to a world in which countries can work together, figure out ways to overcome minor differences without, let's say, shooting each other in its very simplest form. Because we're so much better when we work together. But that work, the ability to work together, takes work. And that's where the diplomacy, there's a saying that we used to use in the Marine Corps 20-some years ago when General Jones was commandant. His phrase was, "Business follows the flag." And when we think about what minerals and things we have here in the ground that we use, we know that international business, if it's going to be successful, enables every country who's involved in that group to succeed, but it has to be able to be done in a secure environment. So if you're a company, pick whatever company you are, and you've got folks that work for you that you say, well, I'm not so sure I can send them to certain parts of Africa because of the terror threat and all of that, or pick your other part of the world. So you need a strong combined military presence that's global, and that doesn't mean you have a base everywhere, but it means you have agreements with other governments, other militaries, other countries, and your allies, assume NATO being one.
But don't you need kind of programs and I'm going to just be blunt. I mean, wasn't a lot of what USAID was doing, with schools, programs, outreaches, so that the DRC or Zambia or Pakistan, which was a big recipient of USAID, if they were working with us in some of our more focus needs, we were helping them with other elements of their civil society, social health building. So do you think there's a cost to somewhat to the strategic contraction of the U.S. on some of those relationships?
Not necessarily, because I started dealing with USAID back in the late 90s when I was stationed in Europe. And I'm not going to share stories.
You can.
No, I can't. No, I can't, because, my mother always said, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And if a person or an entity is not there to defend themselves, don't blindside them. But I saw in the late 90s, and I was in uniform at the time, dealing with USAID, ambassadors, NGOs, whatever. Think of Europe down through Africa. There were problems then. They've gotten worse over time, and I don't care. USAID is just one program. We as the United States need to make sure that the funds we're putting to the programs around the world, whatever it is, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, are one of the things that the military does all day, every day around the world. When there's a hurricane, a tsunami, a bridge collapse, whatever it happens to be. But that money that goes has to be able to be accounted for, and that requires leadership at the top of the organization. In this case, if it's State Department,
Right.
Great. But we had gotten, again, I'll pick on USAID, but I'll also pick on other services in the military, because if you're wasting money, there's only one military service here in the United States that's ever passed an audit, the United States Marine Corps. Not because we're better than anybody, it's just that we hold ourselves accountable, and therefore we can account for the things we do. And the whole, I don't want to get too far off topic here, but the idea is, whether it's the location of minerals in the ground, whether it's educational institutions, in my case, Michigan Tech University, producing mining engineers, all different types of engineers. I heard you talking about the new batteries. 20 years ago, I started advising my grandkids, be the person who invents the next battery. That battery that's not going to be the one we see today, but the one we're going to actually use tomorrow after experimentation with different types of technology. And I also heard the last group talk about on the refining, taking the ore out of the ground and refining it and all the steps. We are so good, and we're leaders in the world in chemistry, mining technology, all the abilities, but also there are other countries, Britain, Canada, whoever it happens to be, who are also darn good at it. Partner with them.
Part of what's in this report, Congressman, is a focus on, key categories of critical minerals and rare earths deficits. And I am not an expert. I can talk about copper, nickel, cobalt, the kind of general stuff. Everybody can talk about that. But there are lots of other rare earths that I can't even pronounce or know about. And I had a call from a very senior executive at an auto firm based in the United States and said, Steve, we have a real problem because there's a geographic monopoly that some nations have around a certain, kind of vital rare earth that we just can't proceed without it. So where is the war room figuring out how we're either going to respond to that, secure that, deal with that? It's a level of urgency and prioritization I don't often hear in this discussion. And I'm just wondering, among you and your colleagues, as you interact with the administration, is there that kind of specificity and traction around some of the, less name brand critical minerals?
The short answer is yes, we're getting there with the current administration. Their goal of actually building business, coming out of the private sector to build businesses, does not mean building a government and building a business are two different things. Because the government is there to create the environment where businesses can be built. And the government's going to play a role on the front end. In some cases, it's going to be some seed money and different things, but it's in the end going to get out of it and let the private sector go forward, because they're the ones that'll produce for a profit. Governments are not supposed to be profitable. They're supposed to be that entity that provides the arena for the private sector and the profits.
As I understand, you were recently in Pakistan, and I don't know if I have this right, you may have visited an operation that is one of the world's richest gold and copper resource places in Pakistan. I remember, not to mention his, complicated former colleague of mine at the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, but I remember when Jeff wrote a cover story of the Atlantic, it was something along the lines, America's ally we love to hate, or that hates us, or the frenemy situation with Pakistan and the US of having a kind of very unstable relationship. What would you prescribe when it came to critical minerals and dealing with complicated countries in the world like Pakistan?
Well, in its simplest form, the last thing you want to have to do is use your military. The first thing you want to do is use your State Department and all elements of that to build those relationships. And the world is relationship driven. I mean, we can look at, history books of thousands of years where relationships haven't been good and people are still fighting over some reason that happened thousands of years ago. The most proactive part of the federal government in this is the State Department that is expanding its very directed efforts.
So if you were basically to move one, Sophia, did you want to ask a question?
Well, since
Yeah, go ahead. So this is Sophia from Politico.
I did have a question since you mentioned the State Department.
Yeah.
Not to get political, but this administration.
It's a word for political.
Go ahead.
This administration, I've heard that after the Ukraine minerals deal was signed, they decided to gut like 2/3 of this bureau within the State Department that handles energy resources. I mean, is that a concern for you as someone who cares a lot about this issue and the role of state?
I could give you a 30-minute answer to that, because when I was getting my MBA 50 years ago, my subspecialty study was bureaucracies. I've been studying bureaucracies, both public and private, for 50 years. So when I could go way down that rabbit hole. The point is,
Let's do a dinner salon with you on bureaucracy.
yeah, I mean, I would love, I've still got notes from 1975.
Yeah.
Okay, the point is, sometimes it's portrayed when a department gets cut for any reason that it's bad. I would suggest to you the State Department as a whole is probably one of the departments most important to begin to reform, resize, redirect first, because it has such global implications on so many counts, not just the dynamics of diplomats, but the dynamics of allowing business to follow the flag that the State Department planted.
Well, with that, I think we're going to have to move on. I want to thank Congressman Jack Bergman for thanking us. I want to thank you for all the work your ancestors did in those iron mines in Michigan. It's important to remember where we came from, and also your service. And I have deal with you. I'd be happy to host an off-the-record salon dinner on bureaucracy if you would like.
I would be more than happy to, and you notice Marines are always concerned about the uniform. Notice the uniform here? Okay, and we didn't even communicate.
Great, thank you, my friend. Thank you very much, Jack. Appreciate it. Now, the next gentleman we have joining us in this show is Adam Burstein. Adam is the Technical Director for Strategic and Critical Minerals in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment in the U.S. DoD. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. You work with my buddy Alex Yergin, I understand, and others. And I always wonder, who controls most of the cards in America's current industrial policy needs, if you will. And we've been talking about this morning, and GLOBESEC is releasing this new report on the widening gap between what we're going to be needing across a wide variety of sectors in the critical materials and minerals needs, and what undercurrent trends we're going to be able to do. So, I look at you as the most powerful guy in the room. How are you fixing it?
Let's see here, is this?
I have no idea. There you go.
Push the button there, there's a light on screen.
Exactly.
Yeah, so we're approaching the problem set in a number of different ways. We have a number of different levers available to us. Looking at it from a policy approach, first, want to make sure that our acquisition system is set up correctly, so that we're being smart about how we're buying materials. We want to make sure that.
Are we smart?
Are we smart? We're getting smarter.
Okay.
For sure, yes. And there's.
I mean, the answer implies lack of smartness.
We've been dealing with this problem set for a long time, right? I mean, we have decades and decades and decades of sort of ignoring the problem, the market is going to fix everything. Meanwhile, offshoring a lot of that capability, in particular to China, and now they're taking advantage of that to eat our lunch. So
Sure.
we're coming around, and we haven't always had the authorities and levers available to us, I think, to fix the problems either. But from a policy perspective, making sure that we're being smart about our buying habits, buying from trusted sources, buying increasingly from domestic sources, making sure that the Department of Defense and the buying power that it has can underpin the industrial base better. And then policy from like a disposition and end-of-life recycling type of perspective as well. So obviously the Department of Defense runs through an awful lot of equipment and material, and we need to make sure that all of the critical minerals that are in those systems, especially those exquisite, high-tech systems, are all being recovered, and that we can keep that within the defense ecosystem, and certainly within the defense industrial.
So within America's strategic needs, when you kind of look at industry, can include, General Motors and Ford and car companies and Tesla, and then everything DoD does, and I'm sure it's so far beyond car companies, but there's auto companies. We have someone from Siemens in the room. You have this going on. How big a footprint does DoD have in that? Is it 20%? Is it 10%? I mean, in terms of being a market maker and a market driver, how large are you?
So surprisingly tiny.
Mm.
So for a very few critical minerals, for some exquisite technologies, really we do dominate those markets. But the number of critical minerals and really specific forms of those minerals are scant.
Mm.
You take rare earth elements as a group, for example. The U.S. last data point I saw, I think we have about 9% of the global market. DoD demand is well less than 1% of that. So we're really talking about small numbers, small quantities, certainly not enough to drive the industrial base. That said, where we have power, through investment, through procurement, is in sending a consistent demand signal to the critical minerals market to de-risk investment across the sector.
Right.
Right.
Alex, I'm going to introduce you, maybe out you here, but Alex works in DoD, and I think you guys are colleagues, but you work, and I may get the nomenclature wrong, but in the division, it's in the Assistant Secretary for Industrial Policy.
Yeah, we both do.
You're both in the Assistant
Industrial-based
Secretary for
policy.
Industrial Policy.
Yes.
We have the representative that's joining us. We'll bring you up here in just a minute, Representative. Great to see you, sir, Jim Baird. And I would just ask you this question about your office, because I think a lot of what we're thinking about in critical materials is being driven by the heart attack this country felt during COVID, over the supply chain crisis, over the concern that there was this staggering dependency in many areas on China. And then when you kind of began scratching beneath the earth, you said, wow, China's really had its act together for a while. China was pre-positioning itself strategically, globally, prioritization. We were just talking about capital finance. A lot of these pieces were put together in China. And this may be an unfair question to you, but how do you feel we are organized to meet that challenge, particularly within DoD? Are we as smart as they are? Do we have the assets we need to achieve success? Or are we, drinking the Kool-Aid that we're so good in America that we can beat? I mean, I'd just like to have a realist perspective on what the deficits are in our planning and policy targets.
Yeah, so obviously China has this decades long advantage.
Was anybody noticing what it was doing during those many decades? You're too young.
Many of those folks are not around. So, the answer is yes. Yes, there were plenty of warning signs, plenty of people raised the flag. I think by and large we have the tools that we need in order to address the problem. By and large, we have the skills that we need to innovate.
Right.
Beyond this, and frankly, that's what gets me up in the morning sometimes and gets me into work, is seeing how industry is tackling this problem head on, creating really innovative solutions. I mean, all credit to the Chinese. They've done a great job taking advantage of the situation that they were given. You know, you have Deng Xiaoping in 1992 talking about the criticality of rare earths and, you know, recognizing the dominant position that they had back then. Right. But you look, especially surprisingly, from the recycling industry right now.
Right.
The number of innovations that they're coming up with to, you know, refine, process, and recover materials from our waste streams is just amazing. And frankly, it's starting to leapfrog some of the technologies coming out of China. And I think this is what is going to win the day for us eventually.
Let me ask you,
We need to be cost competitive.
I don't know if this is in your realm here, but my team asked me to ask you about China's export restrictions in rare earths to the United States. We have a kind of, you know, simmering, surging, declining trade spat with China, where each side is pushing, you know, vulnerabilities that the other has. But rare, you know, restrictions on materials like gallium and germanium, you know, how is the DoD thinking about some of those? And I don't know whether those are national security side. Part of this is dependency of U.S. industry, which is a private dimension to this. How do you get those lines right between what you worry about? Are you worried about General Motors dependencies, or are you worried specifically and primarily about, you know, the Air Force, Marines, Navy?
So I'm worried about what the warfighter has available, right? Because other than, you know, water and people, which are by far the most important things, you know, everything else that we need to fight a war is either grown or mined. So yeah, it worries me every day, right?
I mean, you're
focused on
clear,
that,
so you get classified briefings. So I mean, so without giving away any of the secrets, how worried are you? Scale of 1 to 10.
That's just a challenging question to answer, right? I mean, there are opportunities and there are challenges that have come with what we've seen out of China. You know, obviously, we've seen this level of effort crowd in, this level of attention crowd in on a bipartisan basis. You know, both
Right.
houses of Congress, you know, the White House obviously really getting after it. A lot of momentum in the problem set right now, and frankly, you know, they've helped push prices up for a lot of these commodities, which
Right.
suddenly makes it a more lucrative proposition for a lot of companies, and frankly, de-risk.
Yeah, they drive
the
pricing.
investment.
They drive a lot of the global pricing, which
They
is
do.
Well, I mean, look, I have Congressman Jim Baird here. I want to, you know, move to Congressman, but you know, this raises a really interesting point. My understanding is that China, in a way, it's using its influence, has driven many of these commodities, the prices to such low points that operations can't profitably run, and then they're acquiring them. So why doesn't the United States have a fund to go out and just buy all these properties during the depression that's going on in a lot of these industries around the world? Is that not something that would be in our national security interest?
You know, I don't know that we want to start meddling in the market like that.
I do.
That said, you know, from a stockpiling perspective, certainly we have options available to us to, you know, potentially have offtake agreements to start buying down risk.
Is our stockpile in healthy shape?
No, the stockpile needs help, and Congress recognizes this, and you know, we're seeing a reconciliation, a significant plus up, hopefully. To be fair, in the last just few years, we've seen a lot more attention on the stockpile and a lot more appropriations going in, but it's still falling well short, right? I mean, for 30 years, we used as during the peace dividend to pay off the national debt.
So we're planning to stay in this conversation for a long time, keep coming back. I hope you will feel comfortable coming back and talking about it, because I think it would be useful, particularly as you talk to the folks and stakeholders we have in this conversation about what some of these partnerships could look like to help make your job easier or better understanding. I really appreciate Adam Burstein joining us. He's Technical Director of the Strategic and Critical Minerals Office and the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to bring Congressman Jim Baird up here to respond too, so I hope you'll stick around and listen. You guys ought to know each other.
Well, thank you.
Great, thank you. Congressman, great to see you. Come on up. This is Congressman Jim Baird of Indiana. I had the pleasure of interviewing the congressman during COVID when I was at the Hill, and it was a real pleasure to see you again, sir. I don't know if you've heard very much of the conversation. We've had a really good set of perspectives looking at this widening gap between what America needs in the future development and what it, how it needs to begin addressing some of the critical materials deficits that it has and dependencies. And I just want to start out that you're, on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, Committee on Energy, Subcommittee. You're a science guy who understands these developments. You're also very involved in Africa. And I would love to kind of get your understanding of kind of the global dimensions of America's challenge right now.
I heard the comment that we don't have a lot of these rare earth minerals in stock.
Here we go. There we go.
That work better if it's
Yeah.
green, right?
Yeah, green, there you go.
I heard you mention that we don't have the stockpiles, but let me put this in perspective in another way. I lost this arm in Vietnam, so I've got combat experience, and I can tell you this. When you're in combat and in an ambush, that's not the time to find out whether your weapons are gonna work or not. And so, the U.S. naval base in Crane in Indiana, it's the third largest naval base. But the point is, they go through those munitions periodically and find out whether they're still functioning appropriately or not, or if they need to be destroyed. So my point is that whatever it takes to develop the weapon systems that we need to make sure we secure that supply chain. And
Do you worry that we're not doing enough on that front?
well, I think we've discovered in the last couple of years, I've served on the China Task Force and so on, we're recognizing how fast they're moving. And the other thing that I heard that I would also say to you, I know Purdue University, for example, my alma mater, we're doing a lot of work in chip manufacturing and using that technology. So I have great confidence in the skills that our researchers have and the quality of products that we can put together. And then I have great confidence in our Defense Department from the standpoint of looking at new weapon systems for the warfighter, and I'm interested from a science standpoint of making sure that we have the funds in research that are essential to making sure that we can provide those kind of products to the warfighter.
Do you think, I'm gonna ask this in as fair a way as I can, but when it comes to these national security issues, we're talking a lot, we just had discussion about the stockpile deficits we have and the concerns we have on that front, talking a lot about not just nickel, cobalt, when I asked an AI CEO, a big one, what's his biggest up at night concern issue about his industry, and he goes copper. And when you sort of look at those dimensions that are out there to kind of keep the United States, in the lead in a lot of these arenas. But at the same time, it's just hard to not pay attention to. You've got one of the biggest kind of cost-cutting, bureaucracy-cutting, slashing of programs. Do you have any worry about, those tension points of not having the assets and investment that's going to be needed to kind of get these other dimensions right?
I don't know how much I worry about them, but I certainly am aware of it, and certainly want to make an effort. We need to be aware of it, and we need to make the effort to make sure we have the supply chain secured, to make sure, back when I was trying to buy an F-150 pickup and I found out I couldn't get one just because they didn't have enough chips. And being a farm boy, I thought, you know what, if
You
I
couldn't buy an F-150 truck, best-selling truck in America, you couldn't get one.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, coming from the farm, I thought if I could find a piece of copper and a good hammer and an anvil, I could make my own chip. Well, come to find out, there's about 1,700 or 1,800 chips in each one of these new vehicles. So my point mentioning that is, you got to really understand how much or how little you need, and you got to understand how rare or how plentiful they are. And some of these minerals that were these rare earth, I think there's about 22 of them. They're not in a number or in a quantity in most places that are worth mining for. It's just not profitable. But you still need to require them. So I heard you talk about why not. So we need to develop relationships that make sure we have access to those minerals, just like.
Well, this one, one of the areas that I find that you're interested in, I'm deeply interested in. I wrote a piece not too long ago about, at that point, America's kind of weird dependency on Russia for nuclear fuel. because we had the Nunn Act, quite a long time ago, and so we, began transforming a lot of Russian nuclear materials into, uranium and assets for the U.S. system, so it decimated the U.S. Nuclear fuel production industry. But what's interesting is you introduced the Small Modular Reactor Commercialization Act, facilitating the commercialization of nuclear energy. And one of your worries is ensuring that we become a leader in not only nuclear energy, but we have a supply chain of those resources. And I would sort of tell you that, our own nuclear fuel making capacity is pretty modest right now. And so as you kind of look at this other arena of dependencies, you've been doing a lot with Africa, as I mentioned. What do we need to upgrade or uptick in some of those relationships?
Well, I think what the president just did in Ukraine, trying to have access to those minerals through that negotiation, and I think it's the same kind of thing that's going on in Africa. I'm not sure how well we're doing as a country in terms of developing relationships that we might need to have access to those resources. What does bother me is that we comply with all the environmental rules in terms of our production in this country, and yet China's able to build a nuclear fossil fuel fired energy plant about 1 or 2 a week, and they do not have to comply with the environmental standards that we do. So I think we have to be careful about how we restrict our ability to do some of these things through maybe over regulation, and so we need to be practical about how we pursue our efforts in Africa, for example.
One of the other things General John Allen was talking about up here was the innovation space in rare earth materials. We talked about tailings and copper and other minerals and that, from mines that have been exploited over, a century and a half in the United States. And so there's a lot of material caught in them. And there are sustainable reprocessing methods like glycine leaching and others that can help access. Is there a literacy amongst your colleagues that are concerned about critical materials and minerals about the innovation side of this equation of what can be done inside America that doesn't require, digging a new mine?
Well, I really have a great respect for research and development, and when we've got 11 or 12 national laboratories that we have that work in specific areas, and they can share that information with the industry. They do a lot of basic research, but you could take those raw materials, analyze them or sort them out, figure out ways to sort them out. So those national laboratories really provide a source of information for a lot of the different agencies in the government that provide, and then that stimulates industry, because if you think about basic research, in the industry, you can't really justify some of the basic research. Whereas and trying to decide what's important in basic research today is very difficult, because it may become important a decade down the road. It may be a key piece of information. So I think you have to have people that are scientific minded, that are operating these national laboratories, that have forward thinking, looking for the opportunities, and even discovering new materials or new ways to put together different materials to make better jet engines, or better missile guidance systems, or better fiber optics for communications, or better
Do you think the national investment in national budgets for this, the weapons labs, the science labs, are sound, or are they vulnerable to somewhat President Trump is and Doge are going after?
You define sound, I'm not sure, but
Well, what do you consider sound?
But
Yeah.
I think for the most part they're sound, but is it enough? I'm not sure. China's outdoing us significantly. In the last discussion, they're investing a lot more in research and development than we as a country are. But I think you have to recognize how talented much of our scientific community is, and so just because you can produce large quantities of some kinds of information doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or it will work the best. So there's a gap there for me, and maybe I'm probably biased because I believe in this country, but I have great respect for the skills and talents of our young people. I mean, I'm so far behind some of them, it'll take me a while to catch up, But don't worry about it, I can do.
Well, I think you're doing just fine, but just as we just close out here, if there's one element of this critical minerals equation that you think from a legislative oversight and authorization and appropriations perspective that has to get right, what would you prioritize, you know, as a congressman from Indiana on all these committees?
I would wanna make sure that we have the processes that are critical to us and that we have the supply chain locked up to be able to supply that. And you know, I'm involved in agriculture, my real background, and the science in agriculture really applies to the science and the science. So some of the technologies that we're using in even agricultural production today, and I could go into great lengths about that if you wanted me to, but I don't think you do. But
We'll do a salon dinner for you too, where you can go much deeper into that, but. Last question, did you ever get your truck?
I did.
Oh, great. Well, listen, let's give a big round of applause and thanks to Congressman Jim Baird for joining us. You know, really fun. Jim, thank you. Great to see you, sir. Thank you so much. Good to see you. Okay, Elena, floor is over to you.
Steve, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here. I think that we're working on the program. We're really happy to stay in touch with all of you. There's going to be plenty more in-depth conversations on the topic throughout the upcoming months. And thank you so much, Steve and the Whitehall team, for making it all possible. And there's still coffee and breakfast, so you're very free to head out. Thank you.
Thank you.